The men who came to laugh at her stopped at the top of the slope. Below them, half of a barn stood where a whole one should have been. No hayloft, no second story, just a low roof line, sunk into the hillside like something unfinished, or something that had given up. That was the joke that traveled through the valley that autumn. Sarah Whitcomb had spent the last of her money on half a building. What the men did not know, standing there with their hats in their hands and their breath turning white in the morning air, was that the missing half of that barn was never missing at all. It was underneath them. 3 feet of frozen earth separated their boots from a space that had kept every animal inside alive through a storm that killed livestock on 4 neighboring farms that same week. Somewhere below that packed dirt roof, warmth was doing something none of them understood yet. Something that had nothing to do with fire, and everything to do with a decision Sarah made months earlier, standing alone on that same slope, watching where the water went after it rained. No one had asked her why she chose that spot. They had only asked why she couldn't afford to build higher. By the time this story ends, that question will not matter anymore. A different one will replace it, one the whole valley started asking that January, standing where the laughing men had stood, looking down at a barn that should not have worked, and somehow had. If you're watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like Sarah's survive because people still take the time to remember them. And if frontier ingenuity like this means something to you, consider subscribing. There's more of it waiting. Sarah Whitcomb arrived in the valley in late August, driving a wagon that carried less than most families brought for a single harvest. 2 trunks, a rocking chair with a cracked runner, a dog named Pepper, who had not stopped watching the horizon since they crossed the county line. She had come to bury her husband's name on a deed, not his body. Daniel Whitcomb had died the previous winter, back east, of a fever that took 11 men in the same boarding house within a month. What he left her was not land yet, only a promise of it. A letter from a cousin twice removed who had staked a claim in this valley and abandoned it after 2 dry seasons. The land itself explained why it had been abandoned. 60 acres, and nearly a third of it climbed a slope steep enough that most farmers in the valley called it wasted ground. Good pasture sat at the bottom, where a shallow creek cut through cottonwoods, but the hillside above it was rock-veined, awkward, the kind of ground that broke plow blades and patience in equal measure. The land agent who processed her claim did not try to talk her out of it. He simply mentioned, twice, that the Hargrove place was still available, flatter, cheaper by nearly half, and closer to town. Sarah thanked him and signed for the 60 acres anyway. What she did not explain, because he had not asked in a way that invited a real answer, was that she had walked the slope herself 2 days earlier, alone, while the agent assumed she was inspecting the creek. She had stood at 3 different points on that hillside during a hard afternoon rain, watching where the water gathered and where it refused to. Most people in the valley judged land by what grew on top of it. Sarah had spent childhood summers on her grandfather's farm in Pennsylvania, where the root cellar dug into a north-facing slope kept apples firm past March, long after her aunt's cellar, dug into flat ground, had turned everything inside to mush. She had not thought about that cellar in 15 years. Standing on this new hillside, watching rainwater choose its own path down the rock, she thought about little else. By the 2nd week of September, the town had already formed its opinion of her. A widow, alone, with a dog and a wagon and a piece of ground nobody else wanted. The general consensus, spoken kindly enough within her hearing, was that she would last through 1 winter, possibly 2, before selling out and moving to live with relatives somewhere more sensible. Sarah heard the talk. She did not answer it. She spent her first 3 weeks not building anything at all, only walking the slope in different weather, at different hours, taking note of things that would have meant nothing to a man in a hurry to raise a barn before the frost came. By the middle of October, when the first hard frost silvered the grass at dawn, Sarah finally broke ground. What she began building confused the few neighbors who bothered to ride past and look. It was not a barn in any shape they recognized. She had chosen a spot roughly 40 feet up the slope, where the hillside curved slightly inward, forming something close to a natural hollow. Rather than clearing and leveling the ground the way any sensible builder would, she began cutting straight into the hillside itself, carving out a rectangular space with the earth still rising behind it and to both sides. The structure that took shape over the following weeks had a front wall of timber and stone, facing downhill toward the creek. But where a normal barn would have risen a full 2 stories above the ground, hers stopped at roughly 9 feet, its low roofline nearly level with the top of the surrounding slope. From above, walking the ridge, a person could almost step directly onto the roof without realizing a building sat beneath their boots. Amos Guthrie, who ran the feed store in town and had built or helped build most of the barns within 15 miles, rode out one afternoon under the excuse of delivering nails she hadn't ordered. He stood at the edge of her work site for a long moment before speaking. "You're building half a barn," he said. Not unkindly, more like a man pointing out an obvious mistake before it became an expensive one. Sarah kept working, setting a stone into the base of the front wall. "I'm building what fits the ground," she said. Amos looked past her, up the slope, at the raw earth walls rising on 3 sides of her framework. "Dirt on 3 sides means water on 3 sides once the rains come proper. Means rot in your timber. Means damp getting into whatever you're fixing to store in there." He said it plainly, the way a man states arithmetic. "I've seen it before. Somebody gets it in their head that digging into a hill saves lumber and labor, and by February they're pulling their own walls down before the whole thing comes down on the stock." It was not an unreasonable warning. Amos had, in fact, seen exactly what he described, twice, on farms further north. His concern was not cruelty. It was experience, and experience is a difficult thing to argue against with nothing yet built to point to. Sarah did not argue with him. She thanked him for the nails, which she paid for despite his insistence she needn't, and returned to setting stone once his wagon had rolled back down the lane. She had heard every word of his warning, and every word of it was, on its own, true. What Amos had not seen, because it existed nowhere yet except in the pattern of rainwater she had watched for 3 weeks in September, was the answer to the exact problem he was describing. Word of the half-buried barn spread through the valley faster than Sarah's actual harvest did. By the first week of November, she had grown used to wagons slowing on the road below her property, their drivers craning to see what the widow on the Hargrove neighbor's old ground was building into the hillside. Most people asked no questions directly. They asked around her instead, at the feed store, at church, in the low voices reserved for talking about someone's poor decisions where they might overhear. The kindest theory circulating was that she simply hadn't the money to build a proper barn and was making do with something smaller, cut into the slope to save on timber. The less kind theory suggested she didn't fully understand what she was doing, and someone ought to say something before winter arrived, and proved it for her. Ruth Calloway did say something, directly, which was more than most managed. Ruth ran 40 head of cattle on the largest spread in the valley, land that had been in her husband's family for 2 generations before he died, and left it to her outright, a fact that had earned her a grudging respect nobody extended to Sarah yet. Ruth rode out on a clear, cold afternoon in November, alone, and sat her horse at the edge of Sarah's property without dismounting. "You've got maybe 6 weeks before real winter," Ruth said. "I've got eyes, and what I see is a hole in a hillside with a roof low enough to touch. Where exactly are you planning to keep hay dry through a snowpack if you've got no loft to keep it above the ground? It was, again, a fair question. A loft kept hay dry and out of reach of ground moisture, and Sarah's structure had no loft at all, only that low, earth-covered roofline. The ground's already going to keep it warmer than a loft would, Sarah said. The moisture is the part I'm still working out. Ruth studied her for a long moment. The kind of look a person gives someone they suspect is either very foolish or quietly clever, without yet being able to tell which. That's not much of an answer. It's the honest one I've got right now, Sarah said. Ruth didn't return with an insult, which surprised the two hired hands who'd ridden out with her and had clearly expected one. She simply turned her horse and rode back down the lane, though not before saying, over her shoulder, that she'd be curious to see how the widow's cattle looked come February. It was not said as a threat. It landed as one anyway, because both women understood that a threat wasn't necessary. The valley would settle the question on its own terms, with weather that answered to no one's opinion. What none of them asked, because none of them had watched Sarah stand on that hillside for 3 weeks, doing nothing that looked like work, was the actual reasoning behind the spot she'd chosen. The slope she had selected curved inward, forming a shape closer to a shallow bowl than a straight hillside. During the September storm that had driven most sensible people indoors, Sarah had stood at the base of that curve in her oilskin coat and watched water arrive from 3 directions at once, then funnel itself almost obediently around the hollow rather than through it. The curve of the land was doing something a flat hillside never could. It was directing water past the very spot where she intended to build, rather than into it. That was the first piece. The second came from memory, not observation. Her grandfather's root cellar, the one that had kept apples firm into March, had been dug into a slope that faced away from the afternoon sun, on ground that stayed cooler and more stable through temperature swings that cracked ordinary walls elsewhere on the farm. North-facing ground did not freeze and thaw in the same rapid cycle as ground that baked under direct sun each day and froze hard each night. That cycle, freeze and thaw, was what cracked foundations and heaved stone walls out of position over a single bad winter. Her chosen hillside faced northeast, shadowed for most of the day by a ridge of oak behind it. The third piece, the one she had not fully solved yet, and the one Ruth Calloway had put her finger on without meaning to help, was moisture. Earth on 3 sides of a structure did trap water against timber, exactly as Amos Guthrie had warned. Sarah knew this. She had known it since September. What she had not yet built was the piece that would carry that moisture away before it ever reached her walls, a piece that existed clearly enough in her mind, but had not yet been tested against real rock, real soil, and real weather. She had roughly 6 weeks, by Ruth's estimate, before winter stopped forgiving mistakes. 6 weeks to finish a wall, prove a theory built from a curve in the land and a 15-year-old memory of apples, and give the valley an answer better than silence. The first heavy rain of the season arrived on the 11th of November, 9 days earlier than anyone had predicted. The storm came in sideways, driven by a wind that had shifted out of the northwest sometime after midnight, and it did not let up for 2 full days. Sarah spent most of the first day inside the half-finished structure, checking the seams where earth met timber, watching for the first signs of the moisture Amos Guthrie had warned her about. For most of that first day, the wall held. Water ran off the low roofline the way she'd hoped, following the curve of the hollow rather than pooling against the front wall. Pepper paced the length of the structure and back, unsettled by the sound of rain on packed earth above her, but the timber stayed dry to the touch. It was near dusk on the second day that Sarah heard it, a sound like a knuckle rapping twice against wood, followed by a low groan that did not belong to wind or rain. She found the crack along the base of the eastern wall, where the earth pressed hardest against the timber frame. A jagged line perhaps 18 inches long, wide enough to slide 2 fingers into. Water was already finding it. Not pouring, not yet, but seeping steadily along the crack and pooling in a dark line at the base of the wall, exactly where she had planned to stack the season's hay. She stood in the rain for a long moment, one hand pressed flat against the cold timber, feeling the structure's weakness the way a person feels a fever coming on before it fully arrives. Everything Amos had predicted was happening. Earth on 3 sides, pressing and shifting with the water, finding the one seam in her construction that hadn't been built to hold against it. For the first time since she'd broken ground in October, Sarah allowed herself to consider that she might have been wrong. Not about the slope, not about the curve of the hollow that had guided the storm water safely past her walls. About this one piece, the timber frame meeting raw earth, which she had built the same way she'd seen barns built her whole life, without accounting for the particular pressure of a hillside that never fully dried between rains. She did not sleep that night. She sat with a lantern near the crack, watching the water's slow progress, listening to Pepper's low growl every time the wind gusted hard enough to rattle the roof beams. By morning, the crack had widened another half-inch, and the pool of standing water at the base of the wall had spread nearly a foot across the dirt floor. Ruth Calloway's question echoed back at her with an unpleasant clarity. "Where exactly are you planning to keep hay dry?" Sarah did not yet have hay to protect, not until the next cutting came in from the lower pasture, but the crack in front of her was answering Ruth's question in the worst possible way. If the wall could not hold against a 2-day rain in November, it would not survive a winter of freezing and thawing, snowmelt and spring flood, without failing completely. The storm broke on the morning of the 13th, leaving behind a gray sky and a foot of standing water pooled against the eastern wall. Sarah walked the length of the crack twice, running her fingers along its edge, feeling for the pattern in a failure that had, at first glance, felt random. It was not random. Nothing about water ever was. She simply hadn't been looking for the right pattern yet. For 3 days after the storm, Sarah worked at patching the crack the way any builder would, packing clay and stone into the gap, tamping it firm, watching it hold through a dry, cold spell that followed the rain. The patch appeared to work. No new water found its way through. She allowed herself, cautiously, to believe the problem was solved. Pepper disagreed, though it took Sarah several more days to understand the dog was telling her anything at all. The animal had taken to a strange habit since the storm, one Sarah noticed but didn't think much of at first. Each morning, Pepper would trot to the same spot along the eastern wall, roughly 10 feet north of the patched crack, and dig at the base of it with quick, insistent strokes of her front paws, then move on to her usual rounds of the property. It happened every morning, rain or clear sky, at almost exactly the same spot. On the 6th morning, watching Pepper dig at that same patch of ground yet again, Sarah finally walked over and knelt beside her. The soil there was darker than the ground around it, softer, cooler to the touch, even though no rain had fallen in 4 days. She dug a few inches down with her bare hands and found what Pepper's nose had apparently found long before her eyes had. Water. Not standing, not flowing, but present, seeping slowly through the soil at a depth of less than a foot. It wasn't coming from the crack she had patched. It was coming from somewhere else entirely, moving underground, following some seam or channel in the rock that ran beneath the hillside and surfaced quietly at this one spot roughly 10 feet from where she'd been watching. Sarah spent the better part of that afternoon walking the slope above her structure, this time with a spade instead of an oilskin coat, testing the ground every few feet. What she found reshaped her entire understanding of the hillside. A shallow seam of water moved through the rock beneath the slope, invisible from the surface most of the year, but active enough after heavy rain to travel and resurface wherever the ground allowed it passage. Her crack had not failed because the timber met the earth poorly. It had failed because she had built directly across the path of water that had been moving through that hillside long before she arrived. The fix, once she understood the actual problem, was simpler than the one she'd already attempted, and entirely different in nature. Rather than sealing every seam against the earth and hoping the seal held, she needed to give that underground water a path around her structure instead of through it. A shallow trench cut into the slope above and to the side of the building, angled to intercept the seam before it ever reached her walls. It meant more digging, in ground already half frozen at the surface, with the days growing shorter and colder by the week. It also meant, for the first time since Amos Guthrie had called her half-finished barn a mistake, that Sarah understood exactly why her first attempt had cracked, and exactly what needed to change. She began digging the trench the following morning, Pepper trotting alongside her, no longer needing to dig at that one patch of ground herself. The trench took 11 days to complete, working alone in temperatures that dropped further each week, breaking the frozen crust of topsoil each morning before the real digging could begin. By the time Sarah finished it, cutting a shallow channel roughly 2 feet deep along the upper edge of the hollow, angled to carry the underground seam harmlessly past her walls and down toward the creek, the calendar had turned to the first week of December. That left her badly behind on a problem that had nothing to do with walls or trenches at all. The second cutting of hay from her lower pasture, cut in late October and left to cure in loose stacks near the creek, still needed to be gathered, dried fully, and stored before the first real snow buried it under weather that would ruin it completely. Sarah had perhaps 12 tons of hay waiting in the low field, enough to carry 6 cattle and 2 horses through a full winter if it stayed dry, and nowhere near enough if even a third of it spoiled to mold and rot. She had no loft to store it in, no barn in the traditional sense at all, only the low, earth-covered structure on the hillside, its walls now sound but its interior still nearly empty, waiting to prove whether it could keep hay dry through a season the way it had, so far, kept out standing water. She worked from before dawn until after dark for the better part of 2 weeks, hauling hay by wagon up the slope, packing it into the structure in tight, even rows that left narrow gaps between each stack, a detail she'd insisted on despite the extra time it cost her. Ruth Calloway rode past twice during those 2 weeks, on both occasions saying nothing at all, though her expression on the second visit carried less certainty than it had in November. The gaps between the haystacks were not accidental. Sarah had remembered something else from her grandfather's cellar, a detail she'd dismissed as unimportant 15 years earlier and only now understood the purpose of. Air needed to move through stored goods, even goods kept in a cool, stable space, or the moisture naturally present in cut hay would have nowhere to go, and would settle instead, breeding mold from the inside out regardless of how dry the walls around it stayed. She cut 2 narrow vents into the rear wall of the structure, near the roof line, angled to draw air up and out along the slope of the hillside, rather than straight up into open sky, where wind might drive rain or snow back down through them. It was a small detail, easy to overlook, the kind of thing that meant nothing until the 1 week it meant everything. By the 16th of December, the last of the hay was stacked, the vents were cut, and 6 head of cattle stood inside the structure for the first time, steam rising gently from their backs in air that felt, even to Sarah's uncertain hand pressed against the nearest wall, noticeably warmer than the freezing air outside. The valley's first true winter storm arrived 4 days later. Ruth Calloway did not come alone this time. She arrived on the morning of the 20th with two of her hired hands, and a proposition she made loudly enough for both men to hear, sitting her horse at the edge of Sarah's property the way she had in November, though her tone carried less certainty than her words tried to suggest. "There's a storm building out west," Ruth said. "Bigger than anything we've had yet this year. I'll wager you a milk cow that structure of yours doesn't hold past the second night of it." It was not, strictly, a kind thing to say to a widow who had spent 2 months proving her critics wrong on nearly every point they'd raised. But it also was not entirely unkind. Not from Ruth, who had watched the trench get dug and the vents get cut, and had, against her own earlier certainty, begun to wonder if she'd misjudged the whole enterprise. Sarah considered the wager for a moment longer than Ruth expected. "I'll take it," she said. "But if I win, I want you to walk the ground with me after and see what I built. Not to gloat. So you understand it, in case anyone else ever tries something like this and needs a neighbor who won't laugh first and ask questions second." Ruth's expression shifted, something closer to respect than either woman had shown the other since September. She agreed, shook Sarah's hand, and rode back toward her own spread, where 40 head of cattle stood in a conventional barn built 2 generations earlier, a structure that had never once been questioned by anyone in the valley. The storm Ruth had mentioned arrived on schedule, gathering over the western ridge through the afternoon of the 21st, the sky turning the particular shade of gray-green that every rancher in the valley had learned to read as a warning. By nightfall, snow was falling sideways, driven by a wind that had already stripped the temperature down past anything the valley had seen that season. Sarah stood at the entrance of her half-buried barn as full dark settled in, watching the storm build in intensity, one hand resting on the timber frame she had rebuilt with her own hands after it first failed her. The cattle inside stood calm, steam rising from their backs in air that stayed against every prediction Amos Guthrie had made in October, dry and noticeably warmer than the wind screaming past the doorway. It was, by any measure, the hardest test the structure had faced. It would not be the hardest test it faced that winter. The storm held through the night of the 21st and into the following day, dropping nearly 1.5 feet of snow across the valley before easing into a lighter, steadier fall by the second evening. Sarah checked on the cattle every few hours through the worst of it, and each time she found the same thing: dry hay, calm animals, and air inside the structure that stayed well above the killing cold outside. By the morning of the 23rd, with the wind finally dying down to something closer to a breeze, Sarah allowed herself a rare morning of rest, the first real sleep she'd had in 3 days. It was Pepper's barking, sharp and insistent, that woke her before noon. The wind had not fully died. It had only paused, gathering itself for a second push that arrived from an unexpected direction, swinging around from the northwest to blow now almost directly from the north, funneling straight down the hillside and into the one section of the structure Sarah had never fully tested against wind from that particular angle, the rear vents, cut to draw damp air up and out along the natural slope of the hill, had been positioned to handle prevailing winds from the west, the direction storms in the valley nearly always traveled from. A hard north wind drove snow directly into those vents instead of past them, and by the time Sarah reached the structure, a thin drift had already begun forming inside, along the base of the rear wall, dangerously close to the nearest stack of hay. It was not a large problem yet. It was, however, exactly the kind of small failure that could grow quickly worse if the wind held from that direction through another full night. And there was no way to know yet whether it would. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the cold air pouring through those 2 rear vents, weighing a decision that had no clearly right answer. Sealing the vents completely would stop the snow, but it would also trap the moisture rising naturally from 12 tons of stored hay and the breath and body heat of 6 cattle. The exact condition she had cut those vents to prevent in the first place. Leaving them open risked the drift growing worse before morning. It was Pepper again who offered the answer, though not in any way that felt deliberate. The dog had positioned herself directly beneath one of the vents, out of the worst of the draft but still close enough to feel it, and Sarah found herself studying the angle of Pepper's body, tucked just to one side of the airflow rather than directly beneath it. A partial answer took shape. Rather than sealing the vents fully, Sarah packed loose hay into the outer half of each opening, blocking the direct line for wind-driven snow while leaving a narrow gap along the inner edge, angled downward, that would still allow damp air to escape without inviting the storm directly inside. It was not a solution she had planned for. It was one she built in less than an hour, working by lantern light with her hands numb from cold, guessing at a balance between two competing dangers, with no way to be certain she'd guessed correctly. The wind held from the north through the entirety of that second night, and it was worse than the first. Temperatures that had already been severe dropped further still, and the snow, no longer falling so much as being driven horizontally across the hillside, tested every seam and joint in a structure that had, until that afternoon, seemed to have already proven itself. Sarah did not sleep. She sat near the entrance with a lantern turned low, close enough to hear any change in the sound of the animals inside, close enough to see if the packed hay at the vents began failing under the pressure of the storm. Pepper stayed pressed against her side, ears low, reacting to gusts that rattled the roof beams with a force sharper than anything the first storm had produced. Twice during that night, she checked the rear wall and found the packed hay holding, cold air still moving through the narrow gap she'd left, carrying moisture out the way it needed to, without letting the worst of the wind-driven snow follow it back in. A third check, sometime past what she guessed was 2 in the morning, found one section had shifted. Packed. Hay loosened by a gust strong enough to briefly widen the opening, letting in a thin dusting of snow before she repacked it with hands so cold she could barely feel the hay between her fingers. The cattle, through all of it, stayed calm. That fact alone told her more than any measurement could have. Animals reacted to real danger, to smoke, to cold that threatened them directly, in ways that were hard to fake and harder to miss. 6 cattle stood through that second night, breathing steadily, steam rising from their backs into air that stayed, by every rough sense Sarah had for temperature, after months of living close to this ground, well above freezing even as the wind outside dropped the air to levels that would have been genuinely dangerous for an animal left exposed to it directly. Near dawn, the wind finally began to ease, the second push of the storm exhausting itself the way the first one had 2 nights earlier. Sarah stayed awake until the first gray light appeared over the ridge, unwilling to trust the quiet until she'd seen it hold for a full hour without another gust testing her hastily repacked vents. By full daylight on the morning of the 24th, the storm had passed entirely, leaving behind close to 2 feet of snow across the valley and a stillness that felt, after 2 days of wind, almost unnatural. Sarah walked out from the structure into that stillness, exhausted, her hands raw from cold, and looked back at the low roofline behind her. Snow already settling evenly across its earth-covered surface, as though the building were simply another part of the hillside. Inside, 6 cattle stood calm in dry, sweet-smelling hay, and the temperature, though Sarah had no thermometer precise enough to measure it exactly, felt close enough to comfortable that she found herself, for the first time in 3 days, laughing quietly at the absurdity of how close the whole thing had come to failing over a shift in wind direction nobody could have predicted with certainty. Ruth Calloway arrived on the morning of the 26th, 2 days after the storm had cleared, riding out with the same 2 hired hands who had witnessed her wager in December. She was not alone this time, in a different sense as well. Amos Guthrie rode beside her, having heard, through the fast-moving gossip of a small valley, that the widow's half-built barn had somehow survived the worst storm the region had seen in several winters. They found Sarah outside the structure, forking fresh hay for the cattle, Pepper trotting a slow circle around the property the way she had every morning since October. Ruth dismounted first, walking the last stretch on foot, her breath clouding in the cold morning air as she approached the entrance and looked inside. 6 cattle stood calm and warm, hay stacked in dry, even rows along both walls, the narrow gaps between stacks exactly as Sarah had built them weeks earlier. Ruth said nothing for a long moment, walking the length of the interior slowly, running one gloved hand along the timber frame near the patched crack that had nearly ended the whole project back in November. "You lost the wager?" Sarah said quietly. Not as a taunt, but simply as a fact between 2 people who had both, in their own way, expected a different outcome back in December. Ruth turned to look at her, and whatever she had planned to say seemed to change somewhere between the thought and the words. "I did," she said. "And I'll send the cow over by Friday, same as I said I would." She paused, glancing once more around the interior of the structure. "I'd still like you to show me what you built, properly. Not because I lost a wager, because I've got 40 head of my own, and a barn that costs me nearly a full cord of wood a week to keep from freezing solid, and I'm starting to think I might be doing something wrong." Amos Guthrie, standing near the entrance with his hat in his hands, asked the question more directly. "The crack you patched back in November, what was actually wrong with it?" Sarah told him plainly, without embellishment, walking both of them through the underground seam Pepper had found, the trench she'd dug to redirect it, the vents she'd cut, and later repacked against a wind that had caught her by surprise. Amos listened without interrupting, nodding slowly at several points, the expression of a man revising an opinion he had stated with confidence 2 months earlier, and was now quietly setting aside. Neither Ruth nor Amos apologized outright for the doubts they'd voiced back in October and November. Sarah did not expect them to, and did not need them to. What mattered, standing in that low, snow-covered doorway with 2 of her harshest early critics now asking real questions instead of offering warnings, was simpler than an apology. It was attention, finally, paid to the actual reasoning behind a decision that had looked, for 2 full months, like a mistake nobody could talk her out of. Word of Sarah Whitcomb's hillside barn spread through the valley more thoroughly that winter than the earlier jokes about it ever had. By the following autumn, 2 other families had begun cutting into their own hillsides, following, roughly, the same principles Sarah had worked out through trial and a great deal of cold, uncertain nights. Neither structure was an exact copy of hers. The land dictated different choices, different slopes, different placements for trenches and vents, exactly as Sarah's land had dictated her own particular solution, rather than any fixed formula she could have handed someone whole. Ruth Calloway's own barn, over the following 2 years, was modified rather than rebuilt entirely, a section of its northern wall banked with earth and fitted with a small vent system, inspired by, though not identical to, what she'd seen on Sarah's property that December morning. She never called it Sarah's idea publicly, though she never claimed otherwise when asked directly either, and the 2 women's early rivalry settled, over time, into something closer to a working respect neither had expected back in October. Amos Guthrie kept selling nails and lumber to anyone building a barn, the traditional way, and he kept warning new settlers about the dangers of building into a hillside without understanding what moved beneath it. It was, in its own way, still good advice. Sarah's success had never proven that digging into a slope was inherently wise. It had proven that a slope could be read carefully enough, over enough patient weeks of watching rain and wind and the habits of a restless dog, to work with a builder instead of against her. Sarah herself never grew wealthy from the farm. That had never been the promise the land offered her, not in the way most people in the valley measured success. What she gained instead, standing in her doorway most winter mornings for years afterward, watching steam rise gently from the low roofline where snow had settled evenly over ground that no longer looked half-finished to anyone who understood what lay beneath it, was something closer to what she had actually come to the valley needing. Not admiration, not vindication, exactly, though she did not turn it away when it came. Simply the quiet, steady proof that a widow with little money and a piece of ground nobody else wanted had looked closely enough at the land to make it hold. The barn was never beautiful. It was never meant to be. It was patient, built from a curve in a hillside, and a memory of apples kept firm past March, and that winter, patience turned out to be enough. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.